Hello, I'm Kyle under Christian Idealism, and today we're going to be talking about Canadian politics. Now, I don't know anything about Canada. I am an American, so why am I talking about a country that I don't live in? I've never even visited. I don't know anything about. Okay, so I'm not a subject matter expert when it comes to Canada. So maybe I should get a Canadian on, someone that actually knows what they're talking about. And I do have somebody that knows what they're talking about. Thomas.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas James. I'm a fourth-year university student at the University of Toronto, and I'm part of Kyle's circle of Swinburnians that operate in the background. Today, I'm not here to talk about philosophy or religion, though. We're here to talk about a little bit about my country I'm from, particularly in regards to a video that's been going around on the internet that's doing quite well view-wise that we kind of felt need a little bit of polite kind of response to. But just in general, kind of to take inventory of the type of content that's circulating about Canada on YouTube. I feel it's sort of my due diligence to defend the sort of misinformation that's going around and approach it from an analytic standpoint.
Yes. So it's interesting. Here's the video we're gonna respond to, but if you just put in Canada, you'll get all these different. Well, right now it's like this one. Canada has fallen. Worst country in the world. Wow, it's the worst.
Absolutely,
It's,
absolutely.
it's
Not
worse.
not the active war zones.
It's not. It's worse than North Korea. Like, wow. Okay. And then what else? I mean, there's a few of them, but then there's a history of Canada. But anyways, let me go to the moon video so that people know which video we're going to be responding to today. It's this one. Now we're doing this one in particular because, well, that's the one that I first watched. That's also the one that I'm assuming Thomas watched.
Yep.
And it also has a lot of views. So unlike the other stuff that you might find on YouTube, this one has a lot of views and getting a lot of attention the past week, I would say. So yeah, we're going to respond to this video. Can you hear it? You heard the video, right?
Yep, I got that audio there.
Okay, so yeah, just a little clarify. We're going to respond to this, give a little background. But I guess the first question before we begin is, what is the state of Canadian politics, Thomas?
Well, this is going to be great for everyone who's enjoyed the current show that was the American politics. Is we're about to head into election season in Canada very soon. The state of Canadian politics is all over the place right now. We have a prime minister by the name of Justin Trudeau, who I'm sure a lot of people will have heard of the audience. And he is approaching his 10th year as the Prime Minister of Canada, which would put him, we've had prime ministers that have run for longer. His dad in particular, Pierre Trudeau, was around for, I think, about 13 or 14 years. So 10 years is not the longest, but 10 years is a substantial chunk of time to be the Prime Minister of Canada. There's a regular election that is coming up in 2025. It might get called early. And part of the reason that it might get called early is because Trudeau no longer has a majority in Parliament right now. Now, just as a bit of a background for how things work in Canada, we have a multi-party system. It's not quite as diverse as a lot of European countries where parties seem to be able to spring up and take large portions of the vote and then disappear within 2 or 3 election cycles. Of course, you'll have your old kind of standards, usually a left-wing party or a right-wing party that are pretty stable. In Canada, our political parties tend to be much more stable as well. So it's not dissimilar from the United States in the sense that it is the same actors who tend to play a role in federal politics year to year. Just the collection seems to be larger. There's 5 major political parties. I'll try to run through them as briefly as possible, just for the background knowledge. It's the Conservative Party. They're typically a right-wing party. I would say they're not as right-wing as the Republican. They tend to be more socially liberal than the Republican Party on a lot of things, and I would say that's because on the whole, Canada tends to be more socially liberal. Obviously, there are people who hold socially conservative views, but they are not as numerous as they are in the United States. Moving sort of from the right towards the center, you have the Liberal Party, which is the other of the 2 major political parties. The Conservatives and the Liberals are the only 2 parties that have ever held power in Canadian Parliament. And the Liberals are an interesting party because they are traditionally a centrist party. They are in favor of social programs and social issues, but they're also in favor of catering to big business. And every single Liberal Prime Minister kind of has to walk that sort of thin tightrope there, where they want to balance, keeping the population satisfied, but also keeping the businesses satisfied. Under Trudeau, because of the time period where he's become the prime minister, we live in a kind of a Me Too era and a post that period of time in culture, it's led the Liberals to be a lot more socially liberal. And especially for people who are outside of Canada, that's probably what they're most known for. If you talk to a lot of left-wing people in Canada, they don't feel like the Liberal Party are left-wing enough on some social or some economic issues. So they're kind of a divisive party, because while they're definitely the second choice party for a lot of people, if you're a conservative, unless you're a diehard true blue conservative, you're most likely to put the Liberal down as the second most palatable party. And if you're on the left, if you live in a riding where some of the more left-wing parties can't gain power, the Liberals in this sense can command a large percentage of the voting population. It's a double-edged sword, though, because they can then disappoint a lot of the Canadian population. And that's part of what's going on right now. The NDP, the New Democratic Party, that's party number 3. They're colored orange on any of those maps you see. They tend to be more like a social democrat party. They're typically farther left than the Liberals. They have a lot of power provincially and the individual province level. They don't tend to have it at the federal level, apart from the 2011 election, where they were the official opposition party because of a particularly weak showing from the Liberals. The 2 minor parties that are also in Parliament at this moment in time are the Green Party of Canada. That's self-explanatory. They only contain a couple of seats. And the Bloc Québécois, which is a Quebec interests pro-separatist party that by definition can't win an election because they only run candidates in Quebec. But their job is to kind of push Quebec's interests within the Parliament itself. Justin Trudeau, in the last election, which was 2021, won a minority government. So the way it works is because we have multi-parties, or multiple parties in this case, there is no one political party. It's very hard for one political party to take an absolute majority of seats. It has happened. It happened in 2015 when Trudeau won his first term in office. But because of the diverse voting bloc in Canada, it's more built towards coalition building unless there's a particularly good showing from a party. So while Justin Trudeau did win the most seats, he did not win the popular vote, but he won the most seats, he still did not have enough to form Parliament himself. So he created a coalition government with the NDP and I believe the Bloc Québécois as well to form a sort of ruling majority that would get bills passed. He lost. So it essentially means that Trudeau has to rely on 2 other parties to govern, in a sense. And the controversy has been the new leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, is pushing very heavily towards an early election and a vote of non-confidence in the Prime Minister, where essentially, because Trudeau does not have a majority of members of Parliament, if all of the other parties decide to stop supporting Trudeau, particularly the NDP, they can effectively say, Trudeau does not have the right to rule anymore, we're going to have to go to an election. So that's your kind of rough background for what's going on here. There are people within the Conservative Party who would like there to be an earlier election, mainly because the Conservatives are polling very, very well in the polls for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about over the course of this video. But it means that, Trudeau's position is very, very much on edge right now. It's widely believed he will lose the next election. The Liberals will be kicked out of power by about October of next year, if not earlier. The question is by how much, and the question is kind of what happens as a result of that. So that's a rough kind of primer on the political situation in Canada.
All right. With that in mind, let's start the video.
Live in the developed world. Now, this isn't because of the people, of course, it's because of the prices.
My bill just keeps going up. It doesn't matter how much I try to cut back, it's constantly going up. And I just don't even know what to do about it.
They're ripping us off like they're ripping you off.
I feel like they're all in cahoots.
Over the past few decades, the cost of living in Canada has gone through the roof, propelled by rising costs in housing, groceries, utilities, and pretty much everything else.
True or false?
True or false? Well, that's a very, very loaded question. The correct answer would be true. It has, but it's not as clear-cut as it's being presented in this video. Okay. So the graph he shows on that screen is the Consumer Price Index, and I won't bog everyone down on like the specifics of why the CPI may or may not be a good metric.
Has gone through the roof.
Hold on.
It's a bit like the GDP, where its GDP is a very, very useful tool to measure things in the abstract, but it's not always great to do on the individual level. But let's grant that the CPI is pretty good. The spike that happens, and this is not a good graph. This is one of the big problems I have with this video, is that the sources are not cited correctly. One of the things that Kyle's done a very good job of promoting within philosophy of religion is being rigorous with your sources and being rigorous with your argumentation. So when I see something like this, it's sloppy. This is like, there is a source that is provided, but it's not exactly showing what he thinks it's showing. So the Consumer Price Index rose very, very heavily post-COVID. Canada had been maintaining anywhere between a 0.5 to about a 2, maybe I think 2.3 was the worst it was in the pre-COVID run-up. That was in 2018. level of inflation on the consumer price index, which is just, it's the collection of household goods that you need to survive. It's the inflation in things like groceries and things like gas and things like, basic commodities and necessities. It spiked after COVID for fairly obvious reasons. And one of the things that's going to be a theme in this video that we're repeating is a lot of the problems that are happening in Canada are happening specifically because of our response to COVID, which I would say on the whole was not the worst it could do. It's you're coming out of a pandemic. There's no perfect way to kind of do it, but you could compare us to the States and you could say this probably wasn't as good of a way to deal with it as other countries have. What's important to note about this consumer price inflation stat is that Canada actually performs better than the United States in every year post-COVID. So starting right off the bat, if you look at the inflation in Canada, it feels worse in Canada because we have the smaller economy, because the United States is the workshop of the world. It's the world's biggest economy. It's the most traded valuable currency. So, I know that there's inflation problems going on in the United States. I won't pretend to get into the exact specifics about what's going on here, just because I'm not an American. I don't want to speak about American issues there. There is a general perception in Canada that things are worse off, and we'll talk about why that is. But the cold facts just show that, on the most part, what we're seeing in Canada is not significantly different from the United States. So there are specific housing issues that we will get to that are very important, and that some of this I will actually agree with Moon on these points. But the overall line of Canada is in a significantly worse place than the United States, I don't think is true.
Okay.
Propelled by rising costs in housing, groceries, utilities, and pretty much everything else. Meanwhile, wages have stagnated since 2006.
True or false?
This is true, but this is actually a point that's not necessarily against Trudeau. And I know that he has not mentioned Mr. Trudeau up until this point in time, but he's going to become more important in the video. This is true for a variety of reasons. In fact, 2006, Stephen Harper, who was a conservative prime minister, was still in power. So this is a bipartisan issue. There's a lot of so Canada's business climate is very, very bizarre to explain to an outsider. Part of the reason that it can be viewed as being prone to stagnation is because we actually have a lot of our critical sectors are under the control of monopolies right now. And that's partially as a sort of cultural protection against the United States of America. So if you come up to Canada, one of the things you'll notice is that you don't find American grocery stores. You don't find American banks. You don't find American telecom companies. This has created an environment in Canada where Canadian monopolies are encouraged. So if you're a sports fan, for example, you'll notice that every second arena in Canada is named after Rogers or Bell, which are the two major telecommunications companies. We have 5 major banks that run the industry in Canada. There's a couple of outsiders and there's a couple that are trying to challenge. But for the most part, we're very protectionist about our industries. This has good and bad sides to it. Obviously, the telecom monopoly in Canada is horrendous. The situation with Rogers and Bell, as a Canadian, is kind of horrible to watch them slowly price gouge us out of certain things. And perhaps in that environment, a government, be they liberal or conservative, should have stepped in to bust a monopoly before it became too much of a problem. But something like the banking monopoly has actually worked in favor of Canada sometimes. We were not hit as hard during the 08-09 recession, largely because we prevented American banks from existing within the Canadian landscape. And in fact, one of the reasons, if you look in the United States, I know TD, which is Toronto Dominion Bank, is opening up a lot of branches in the United States or under banks that are owned by TD. This is because they have been allowed to exist as essentially big fish in a small pond that's allowed them to move south of the border and have the startup capital that's necessary that perhaps a startup American bank would not have. So the wage stagnation is difficult to say, because in certain instances, the monopoly has contributed to that. And in certain instances, the fact that, typically like most globalized Western countries, a lot of our production is happening outside of the country. So it disincentivizes local companies from really kind of pushing to innovate. So, but it's a bipartisan issue, and it's an issue that's been deeply rooted in Canada for decades at this point in time. It only feels worse now because of the connection to COVID, because of the connection to all the other things they talk about: housing, groceries, utilities, which we'll get to later in the video.
Yeah.
While immigration has only increased, and it's led to a wide range of debilitating social issues, like a staggering 20% rise in homelessness since 2018. It's a process that
this is a bit of a negative rhetorical technique as well. I just want to note that here is it's like he's keeping those facts so close to each other: the immigration rate and the rise in homelessness.
Yeah.
I'm not going to speculate about Moon's personal politics. What I will say, from having typed out this entire video script, is he's an incredibly sloppy writer. And I'll point out a couple of these details a little bit later, but that point is particularly insidious because something like homelessness is a very, very multifaceted issue. And again, it's not an issue that Canada's alone in experiencing. I mean, Kyle, you're from California. You've heard all the
Yeah.
conversation about homelessness. It's like,
I
this
live
is
in a city with homelessness. So,
exactly. And
yeah.
this is not a uniquely kind of Canadian issue in the sense. I'm not saying that a rise in homelessness isn't bad. Obviously, it's a very serious problem that we need to tackle, but I would be skeptical that it's directly tied to an immigration rate.
Right.
Process that the government has largely let happen and even encouraged in some cases, as we'll find out later. But the reality on the ground is that living in Canada is a question of survival, and for most people, these problems have massive negative impact.
Well, I mean, everyone, that's every country.
That's every country, man. It's like, this guy's making it sound like this is Sudan or something like that. It's like, yes, there are people who are very, very much struggling in Canada. I work downtown, I see homeless people, and it's -5 degrees Celsius. I'm sorry, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's freaking cold outside today. I would not want to be out in the street today, and I wish we had the support system to be able to help these folks. It's not like we're going through, the greatest period economically, but there's a lot of hyperbole in these kind of sentences. It's like, a lot of the issues that you're going to see in these videos, you'll also see them if you live in London, England, if you live in New York, if you live in Los Angeles. These are problems I think the Western world are facing as a whole. Canada might be doing some things better. Canada might be doing some things worse, but I don't think, this kind of inflammatory language is necessary here.
And how they live their lives. It's clear from the stats that Canadians are suffering.
That's a lot of stats, bro.
There's a lot of stats there, and unfortunately, most of them, because I paused the video and I went through all of them.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of those stats are not good. Government debt and the gold reserves were two of those stats he used. Now, anyone who's taken a basic economics class will tell you that government debt is not nearly the bogeyman that everyone makes it out to be.
Yeah.
Because governments and countries, it's more the country than the government itself. They're stable. The United States of America, God hoping, is not going to not exist in 100 years. If there is the potential for that debt to be paid back, this is a very simplified explanation, but it's because you will theoretically always have an America, or you'll always have a Britain, or you'll always have a Germany. This idea of government debt is not as scary as people make it out to be, unless you're a country like Argentina who can't manage their economy and becomes, sort of like a place where people don't want to invest because of the economic instability. But a country like America, which is, again, the largest economy in the world, the workshop of the world in some senses when it comes to certain forms of business, this is not going to be so much of a problem. Gold reserves, again, that's got some countries don't even rely on the gold standard. And 3 of the stats he showed up there is housing. One of the themes that you'll see is he's trying to paint this huge blanket of there's so many issues in this country. A lot of them come back to housing. So I'd rather we stop pretending like, the entire room is on fire when it's only the table that's on fire.
Yep.
Canadian Social Survey of 2024, nearly half of the respondents said that their budgets couldn't keep up with the rising costs. Canadian household debt is another indicator of how bad it's gotten. Per citizen, it's the highest. And
those are 2 more things right there. They're not good statistics. If you ask most Canadians on the street, they will tell you that things are not going so great. I'm not gonna try to take them away from that point. It's interesting enough, if you read that actual social survey, the only 2 things the article mentions are housing and groceries. That's it. They don't break down the survey methodology, but it's very clear, referencing this BBC article about the share of the GDP, it's housing. It's housing over and over and over again, but it's housing in a couple of key particular areas for a couple of key particular reasons, which we'll get to as we go on.
Yeah, we'll talk a lot about the housing situation.
The G7. But what really paints the picture is how Canada's Prime Minister chose to speak to his country and the response he's gotten from his fellow Canadians. Strangely, Trudeau decided that emulating bad YouTube apology videos was the best for his message on immigration. The response was, as you would expect, absolutely terrible. But
yeah, I mean, would you agree with that, I guess?
I would say Trudeau is a largely unpopular figure right now. So anything he put out was going to be responded to in a negative manner. Now, let me be entirely honest with you. I tend to lean more towards the Liberal Party. That is my political bias. I'll just state that right there. I don't particularly like Trudeau. I think Trudeau probably should have stepped down after the last election cycle and given it to someone else. He's a widely unpopular figure. Now, there's a bunch of different reasons for that. A lot of them actually go back to his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who is a personal political hero of mine. He was the prime minister between, I believe it was 1968 to 1979, and then he took over from 1980 to 1984. And he is viewed negatively in two particular regions of the country. One of them is among the pro-separatist parts of Quebec, which are thankfully disappearing. They still exist. They still will always exist, but they're not as prominent as they were 30 years ago. And that's because Trudeau basically did everything in his power to stop Quebec from leaving. Within the law, of course. He changed the constitution.
Yep.
He encouraged bilingualism. He instituted something called the War Measures Act, which he used to prevent a terrorist group called the Front de Libération du Québec from attempting to seize power in Montreal. And again, it's an oversimplification, but so he's not viewed particularly positively, and he's viewed as having kind of sold out Quebec as a Quebecer himself to English Canada. But where Trudeau is most unpopular, and it's continued on to his son Justin, is in Western Canada, particularly in Alberta and particularly in Saskatchewan. And I won't go into the long history of that. Trudeau tried to nationalize an oil company called Petro-Canada. The Albertans didn't like it. I won't bore you with the intricacies of 80s Canadian politics, but that name Trudeau leaves a very, very bitter taste in a lot of Western Canadians' mouths, to the point where it's reflected negatively in his son as well. There's all sorts of different reasons for why not to like Trudeau. I will personally say, though, the apology video was a bit goofy. I mean, I imagine if Biden had done that, would be my kind of point. Like, the memes we'd get would be incredible.
All right, I'm going to continue. I'm going to try to
go
keep this stream in an hour if possible.
Yep, that's perfectly good with me.
Around 68,000 dislikes and 22,000 likes at the time of this video. In the 7-minute long over-polished video, Trudeau covers the general basics that you'd associate with terrible apology videos. He begins by saying he'll admit his mistakes, even though he doesn't really throughout the video. Then he immediately shifts the blame to bad actors, despite the fact that he implemented the policies which let it all happen.
Just pause here for a bit.
Bad actors, like
I'd like to quote Justin Trudeau from the video for you right here. He said, looking back, when the post-pandemic boom cooled and businesses no longer needed the additional labor help, as a federal team, we could have acted quicker and turned off the taps faster. So if that's not an admission of guilt or an admission of fault, I don't know what is. It's like, there is such a negative aura around Trudeau that, Trudeau could like cure blindness in a person. And there are parts of the Canadian population that would still say, oh, well, he could have done it to more people. He's still not that good. He only used it on one person. I also, it's really starting to irk me the longer we get in the video, so I'll try to keep my cool as much as possible. The policies. What policies?
Yeah, all right.
like fake colleges and big chain corporations have been exploiting our immigration system for their own interests. So we're doing something major. We're reducing the numbers of immigrants.
Let me speed this video up a bit.
Yep, you can turn it up to like 0.25 or something like that, 0.5.
So will come to Canada for the next 3 years.
The biggest fault with this press release, though, lies in the short section where he diagnoses Canada with a labour shortage. While Trudeau himself doesn't go into much detail about why this is apparently the root cause of Canada's problems, the video does use part of an interview with Dennis Darby, a representative for Canadian industry. He says while talking about Canada's industry that, quote, "We've had a chronic shortage of labour over the past decade. It's the #1 issue."
So we think there needs to be more, and you need to continue to push that, push the pedal to the floor to bring more people into Canada.
This moment has become a focal point in the overwhelming negative response.
Kyle, let me just ask you a basic question here, because this is something even you can tell. If you were doing some sort of video on philosophy of religion, you were talking about someone who's analyzing Swinburne or analyzing Sijuwati or Rasmussen or whoever the hell else, would you be consulting the YouTube comments for like realistic advice in this kind of case?
No.
Like the next two videos is going to be a lot of putting up comments, and it's like, no, let's go to the experts. Let's go look at the stats, please. Let's not confuse a general labor shortage with labor shortages in specific areas. Canada has a chronic labor shortage, particularly in the medical field. And that's not even a federal responsibility. That's a provincial responsibility. There's shortages in the agricultural industry. There's shortages in the construction industry. I don't know why we have to pretend that the entirety of Canada is facing a labor shortage when that's not what Trudeau's talking about. And a lot of this is, again, it's the pandemic, Pandemic kept a lot of people at home and living off their savings because that was more expedient to do. Why would we, expect there to not be a labor shortage in a time period where people are choosing not to go to work?
Exactly. Yeah, I found it kind of weird that he was going out for the YouTube comment section as if that's like a reliable source.
Especially when he's such a polarizing figure. It's like going into any YouTube comment section about Biden or Trump. It's like, you're going to be getting misinformation. Like, why would you even bother?
Yeah, well, the other thing too is, it would be like me going on Reddit or something, like, oh, Reddit. Like,
Reddit is fact, bro. They said it, therefore it's true, Imagine if r/atheism had that kind of field day.
Yeah, I know.
the video. And of course, lots of the top comments are just people that are astounded by how tone deaf the video is. One of them writes, "This is like someone who sets fire to everyone's house in the street, then sits them down for a serious conversation on fire safety." Another lays blame squarely on Trudeau's shoulders, saying, "People are mad because people born and raised in Canada can't afford to live. You've been talking about housing your entire time in office, and yet the problem has only gotten worse." But the video's insinuation that Canada's problems lie with the labour shortage has been particularly highlighted, with lots of comments denying that it's even true, let alone relevant. It's because it shows just how out of touch Trudeau and the establishment have become to regular Canadians' problems. To back up the point, they took interview quotes with CEOs.
That's not how this
on the
works,
biggest
though,
problem-
and this is it's a very important thing you need to understand about Canadian politics versus American, or in this case, he's a British person, and which is weird because he should know better because we inherited our political system from them. But like in Canada, we don't elect our prime minister; we elect our local representatives who happen to pledge allegiance to a prime minister. So when I go to the ballot, I'm not putting a check next to Trudeau or Poilievre like I would in the States for Biden or Trump. I'm voting for a local representative, and in that sense, they are very beholden to us, because if we don't like what they're doing in Parliament, or we don't like what their party is doing in Parliament, we'll kick them out immediately in the next election. No shot.
Right.
So this idea that they're not in touch with Canadians or beholden to, I find that to be kind of offensive.
Yeah.
Problems that they're facing instead. All the while, Trudeau is acting like evil corporations are the real problem, while ignoring the fact that he's the one in charge of regulating them. The reality on the ground, though, is that there are plenty of jobs in Canada, but wages have stagnated, so they just don't pay enough to give people good lives, or even keep them out of poverty. The
Yes. So which is it? Is my first kind of question, or is it both? We're kind of dancing around whether it's the wages that have stagnated that are the problem, or there is a legitimate labor shortage. It's like, I'd appreciate if you kind of picked a lane and stuck in it. The other thing that, and this is fairly basic political science analysis. And I mentioned it earlier when I was talking about the Liberal Party, is that every Liberal Prime Minister has to walk that line between catering towards the social issues and catering towards the businesses. So, it's usually a left-wing populist tactic to go, Trudeau should be reining in the businesses more, which I do actually personally believe to a degree, especially when it comes to some of the monopolies that are developing in Canada. But the issue is, it's like, he can't also immediately clamp down on the businesses, because then he creates a hostile environment towards investment in Canada. And that's how the world works. We live in a global capitalist system. That's how it works. You need investment from large corporations to stimulate the economy.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's a delicate dance. And I think if you look at Trudeau's track record, he has done a pretty good job in, doing things that one would expect, like raising corporation tax or raising tax on the wealthy percentage of the population. So this idea that he's the one in charge of regulating them, it's way more complicated than that. But it's a 60-minute YouTube video, so I don't know what else I expected.
unrelenting cost of living crisis in Canada has been disastrous for the country and its people. No cost is more impactful or substantial than housing, and it means that rising housing costs have been the biggest factor in the entire crisis. So there's no better way to see how bad things have gotten than by looking at Canada's largest city of Toronto and its terrible housing crisis.
All right.
Housing?
So I'm a native Torontonian. I'm born and raised here. I'm proud to be from here. I even say Toronto without pronouncing the T. This is a terrible way to analyze Canada's housing market. Because Toronto and what we refer to as the Golden Horseshoe, which is the region around Toronto, is a uniquely bad housing environment. So Toronto is Canada's largest metro area. It's also the largest city. Number 2 is Montreal, and then number 3 for the metro area is Vancouver. Montreal, interestingly enough, avoids a lot of these problems because it is at least trying to appear outwardly as a French-speaking city. There are a lot of English speakers in Montreal still, but I would say still the majority of Montreal is francophone. The issue is that because it's a French-speaking city, the housing crisis is not as bad because they don't want the English language immigration into Quebec. So Toronto and Vancouver is the largest and the second largest Anglophone majority metro areas get hit disproportionately when it comes to housing. I got some numbers in particular that we can crunch later. Yes, in Toronto, the housing market is bad. Yes, in Vancouver, the housing market is bad. I would actually say it's probably worse in Vancouver than it is in Toronto. But looking at Toronto and using it as a microcosm for the problems in Canada, especially compared to other large Canadian cities like Edmonton, like Calgary, like Ottawa, like Winnipeg, it's not fair to do because those cities are not undergoing anywhere near as bad of a housing crisis as Toronto is.
All right. We can get into housing now. I'll play the video and you can tell me when to stop.
Yes, sir.
Before we continue, I want to tell you about our video sponsor.
We can skip this entire section right here because I don't think you want to promote Extra necessarily.
Now, Extra is offering up to 55% close to the Arctic Circle. Canada has quite a low population of using the code MOON if you head to extra.com/moon and make sure to use the code MOON. Like other countries close to the Arctic Circle, Canada has quite a low population compared to its massive tracts of land. But even with that relatively low population, a large chunk of those people live in a small collection of large cities, over 73% as of 2020.
Actually, how come no one lives in the Arctic Circle? Is it too cold?
It's partially it's too cold, like for the same reason that no one lives in Alaska. It's not even
Yeah.
that it's too cold necessarily. We have this thing called the Canadian Shield, which is a giant rock formation. Very hard to farm in that area. I'm going to throw out this minor nitpick because one of my the subjects that I'm studying as in university is urban planning, and this is just blatantly wrong. 73% is the 42 largest census metropolitan areas in the country. He's making it sound like 73% of the population live in like 5 cities. That's really disingenuous.
Right. Yeah.
Canada's population and economy is therefore focused on these large cities. Toronto is the crown jewel, with a population between 6 to 8 million people depending on how you define the city. It's the centre of Canada's financial sector, and during their time in power, Trudeau's coalition government have taken advantage of this imbalance to push forward an agenda focused on benefiting the wealthy minority in control of those cities. And it's come at a massive cost to Canada's rural population, but it's also done terrible damage to Canada's urban people as well. A lot of this
is a great example of just, you know, it's word salad to a degree. It's like it's disadvantaged the rural population. How? We're talking about housing here. Like, I'm not entirely sure what policy Trudeau has done in
Really
particular.
argument that they presented, like the premises and the conclusion, you know.
Yeah, it's like a non sequitur. It's like if we're just going to spin together buzzwords, and that's what's very interesting is from what little I know about Moon, I know he does fall on the right hand side of the political spectrum. The report he's just cited is coming from an NDP aligned think tank. So it's like which is it? If we're going to play the kind of, you know, anti-elitist philosophy that someone like the NDP would champion, in like, you know, Trudeau's not harsh enough on taxing rich people, Trudeau's not harsh enough on corporations, we got to go the full circle. But because this guy's right wing, he's just kind of using it to criticize Trudeau and not really to propose any substantive policy. And by the way, that's not a shot against all right wing people. One of my friends who helped prepare this video with me is a member of the Young Conservative Club at his local university. So I made sure I got partisan support on checking this. We all just want to make sure that Canada is not being misrepresented like this badly.
Right. Right.
Financialization. As described by Canada's Centre for Housing Rights, financialization is when housing transforms from something necessary for survival into a speculative financial asset. Regardless of where you live, you'll probably have seen this happen. Over the past 50 years, buying a home has gone from an achievable goal on an average salary to something that only the richest can afford. Meanwhile, investors who got involved in the housing market have seen their assets skyrocket in value. But while all of this is true, it fails to see the larger point. Financialization isn't just housing becoming a financial asset. It's the transformation of a whole society to increase the value of financial assets. Nowhere is this worse than
I'm not
Toronto.
going to actually offer any serious criticism of financialization, because this is actually the one part of the video where I agree with him. All 3 levels of government, municipal, so the City of Toronto, the Province of Ontario, and the federal government in Ottawa, failed to properly regulate housing and prevent this sort of thing from happening. I can't tell you how many people I know at my place of work, or at my parents' place of work, or at my friend's place of work, or their family and friends, their place of work, who use housing as an asset to make a quick buck. And it doesn't just happen in Toronto. Alberta is about to undergo it really, really seriously now, because housing prices in Alberta were relatively low for a while. But it's Toronto and Vancouver, you're looking at about $1 million a house in Canadian. So for American viewers, it's about 700,000 American. That's bad. But most other places in the country are not suffering that bad. Montreal, Calgary, you're looking about $500,000 Canadian. That's about half as much as in Toronto and Vancouver. For American viewers, it's about $350,000 US for a house. If you're going down to some of the smaller towns, especially those that are outside of the province of Ontario and British Columbia, which are hit disproportionately by the housing prices. If you go to places like Regina and Saskatoon and Saskatchewan, if you go to places like Moncton or St. John in New Brunswick, you go to, you know, the provincial cities in Quebec like Chicoutimi or Trois-Rivières, even if you go to places outside of that golden horseshoe in Toronto, they're not being hit that bad. And I would say most mid-sized cities, you can get a house for anywhere between 150 to 300,000 US dollars Canadian, or sorry, US dollars. So while I appreciate, you know, a global spotlight on Toronto as like kind of a wake-up call for politicians to fix this problem, it's not fair to drag down the entire country of Canada just because 2 of our largest cities are difficult to live in. It's like dragging down the United States because of New York and LA. That's not fair.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was about to say, because, like, of course, LA, New York have, like, terrible housing prices, but can't compare it to the rest of the country, you know? So, all right, let's continue.
A city where financialization has been the cause of more than a 40% increase in home prices over the last 5 years alone. But as we'll soon find out, it's also damaged a lot more than just Toronto's housing market. The true cost of Canada's financialization is laid out in the book Critical Dialogues of Urban Governance Development.
Did you look over this book?
I have looked over this book, and it's interesting. There are parts that I agree with, and there are parts that I disagree with. But the most interesting thing is very little of what's in that book is actually making the point he thinks it's trying to make, and we'll go into that a little bit more. This is clearly he either ChatGPT'd it or he did not read the necessary portions of the article to understand what was going on.
Right.
and activism. While it's got a wordy title, the actual content is more straightforward than you'd expect. It's basically a collection of essays with some of them describing just how badly financialization has messed up both London and Toronto. Of course, we'll be focusing more on Toronto, as chapter 14 describes financialization as lots
with it.
Well, it's just again, another great example here is just like this notion of financialization is happening all across the Western world. You know, I happen to visit the United Kingdom a lot. I know that London's being hit particularly hard, regardless of him mentioning it in the video. It's just a case where when these cities become these globalized, attractive cities that want to pull in, you know, various elites and rich folks from all around the world, it's only natural that housing is going to become an asset, because the idea of owning, you know, a penthouse condo in Manhattan or in London or in Toronto is just going to become appealing by definition. So, you know, I like that he's referencing the fact that it's going on around the world, but it also kind of weakens his point that what's going on in Canada is uniquely bad. You know, it's bad.
Right.
It's a bit of a problem. We were starting to get it under control as well, which we'll talk about later in the video, but it's not uniquely evil compared to everywhere else in the world.
lots of different causes, but one of the main ones is the relatively recent globalization of finance. Even 50 years ago, your options as an investor were mostly limited to your own country. You could invest in foreign companies pretty easily, but other foreign assets were much harder to get into. But that's all changed, and now if you want to put your money into foreign housing markets like Toronto's, you easily can. Banks have even created ways of storing the assets, which let you buy a share in a fraction of lots.
Hold on, I gotta mute myself.
Yep, you good.
Of other houses rather than just one building or home. It was this process that led to the financial crash of 2008, but it's also changed the very fabric of cities as well. This is where
and this is a really weird point as well, because, you know, partially because of Jean Chrétien, who was a prime minister in the 1990s, and as I mentioned earlier, that thing with the weird banking monopoly we have in Canada is that we were not hit particularly hard by the banking crisis. And we've also got to remember that, like, these are really, really gross oversimplifications. You know, the financial crisis was caused by subprime lending. It was caused by, you know, the sort of shadow banking system, you know, loose monetary policy. You can't just pin it on one policy that may or may not have happened. It was a veritable shitstorm of a whole bunch of different things happening at the same time.
From other Western megacities. When the financial markets exploded over the past 50 years and the economic influence increased, Canada was ahead of the curve. Nearly all Western cities' economies have changed their focus from manufacturing to finance and technology. And this changed the cities themselves, as Chapter 9 describes. This has led to rapid gentrification of the inner city, deconversion of many older housing units from rental tenure to owner occupation, and a slow shift of the immigration reception neighborhoods into the suburbs. In English, this means as the city center becomes the place where all the wealth was created and concentrated, the focus of the city naturally shifted as well. Neighborhoods closer to the city got more expensive, and the old residents got pushed out by investors buying up the homes. These old, middle, or lower class homes were then either sold to richer people to live in, or even converted into much more expensive luxury
housing. And this
housing.
Makes no sense. And as an urban planning student, you know, this really, really irks me, because that's not how that works. It's not like neighborhoods that are immediately close to the city center are, first of all, necessarily the immediate targets of attraction. People want to go where housing supply is readily available. And some of these neighborhoods, especially in downtown Toronto, are very, very low population because they exist as single-family neighborhoods. Now, you can redevelop blocks or streets if you want to, but it's very rarely a full neighborhood. I think the last major neighborhood redevelopments that took place in Toronto were the slum clearances that happened between the 1950s and the 70s. We haven't really taken that much of a hacksaw into downtown. Most of what you're seeing in the development of downtown, Toronto, particularly in the condo boom, is just people taking, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 story, I don't know, shops, maybe small apartment buildings, and turning them into, like, you know, 30, 40, 50 story condos. And it's really weird as well, because it's like, this is not imminent domain. Like, these developers are not coming up to, you know, these theoretical residents that are close to the downtown and saying, hey, you have to sell us your home because your land is more valuable. I mean, the dirty little secret about the housing crisis is that, you know, and I've encountered this firsthand in Toronto, is a lot of these upper middle class residents want housing prices to be high so they can flip them for twice as much as they paid when they bought them, maybe in the 90s, the early 2000s, when it wasn't that expensive. But this idea that a developer can just pull into a neighborhood and say, hey, I want your houses to build really, really rich luxury condominiums that only, like, the top 10% can afford. That's ludicrous. That's not how this policy works.
Right.
Continued over decades, its effects reached every part of the city. Any neighborhood with good transport links to the center got much more expensive, until housing prices in the whole city went sky high. Working people then only got pushed further and further out. Toronto is the financial hub of Canada.
Except that's not exactly true either, because, you know, the idea of working people being pushed further and further out implies that, like, if you go to the suburbs, it's going to be cheaper, and that's not necessarily true. Because a lot of the suburbs around Toronto were zoned to single family housing because they are available single family housing. they're just as expensive. And this is part of why it's become such a problem in Ontario, is it's not like the housing crisis stops at the borders of Toronto, the municipal city of 3 million people. It extends into the greater Toronto region of like 6 million people, to the point where Hamilton, Ontario, which is, I believe, the third largest city in Ontario, it's a city of about 500,000 just across the lake from Toronto. It's undergoing like a miniature housing crisis, where homes are now going for like 700, 800,000 Canadian, which is about 500,000 USD, just because it's close enough to Toronto. So it's not like people are being pushed out more and more. A lot of the low income people who I work with actually live and work in the downtown core. They're just renters. So let's also make sure we separate between like a buyer's market of people like buying property and people who are purely just renting property.
Similar things have also happened to the rest of Canada's largest cities, as shown in this graph of Canadian housing prices. So far, all of these things we've talked about are pretty universal across developed economies. So what's made it so bad in Canada specifically? Well, the book we've been discussing so far analyzes all of this in greater detail. There's a few different reasons for why Canadians have been hit especially hard. First, Canada's welcoming of foreign investment into the housing market has been disastrous. For example, a report on Vancouver and Victoria's housing markets showed that over 6 billion Canadian dollars have been laundered and invested by multinational criminal organizations, and that figure.
And that's partially to do with, Vancouver's proximity to Asia as a Pacific port. The Chinese Communist Party has officials that have residence in Vancouver. That was part of the big controversy. I don't know if you were paying attention a couple of years ago when we had those 2 Canadian diplomats who were being held hostage in China while we were arresting, I believe it was the daughter of the CEO of Huawei. That was one of the reasons, is because she lived in Vancouver. So it doesn't surprise me that, in any crooked industry like real estate, that there are gangs operating around in that sort of sense.
All right.
will most likely pale in comparison to the so-called legitimate foreign investment as well. It was only a few years ago in 2018 that Toronto started taxing foreign housing market investment above domestic investors. But the problem is also with the policy and the central government. Canada went above and beyond other Western economies in catering to speculative investment in the housing market. Chapter 9 of the book explains how this happened in a few short steps. First, the Canadian government made sure that investors could get credit from the government pretty much risk-free with virtually no interest. The advertised reason for this move was to stimulate the economy with more private investment, but it didn't quite work out that way. Instead, the massive amounts of free
pause there,
credit
actually. So you'll notice that article that he just had on the screen was completely blurred out. Apart from the title, if he pulls it up, just play it through.
Pretty much risk-free with virtually no interest. The advertised reason for this move was to stimulate.
Look at that. There's nothing else in that article. So I tried to put that article into Google. I tried to reverse search it, couldn't find it. Interestingly enough, when I went to open the chapter of the book he's talking about, chapter 9, and I read through it, because I was talking to my friend who's an economics major, and he was like, what is he talking about? There is no point in time where the government has ever given risk-free credit to just, yeah, here, have some money, go invest in our economy. What could possibly go wrong? Like, no government is that irresponsible. What he's referring to in the book was what the government attempted to do to stimulate the economy after the recession in 08-09. The problem is the prime minister at the time was Stephen Harper, a conservative, not Justin Trudeau. So he puts up Trudeau's face and he's like, Trudeau gave this money out. It's like, did you read the chapter of the book you're talking about? You know? And listen, I'm not going to comment as to whether or not the policy here particularly, because he's not describing it correctly, but I'm also not well versed enough in my, mid-decade century Canadian economics to comment on Harper's particular policy on that line. I don't think it's the sole cause of the housing market crisis. So if I have to offer defense of Stephen Harper, I would say whatever he did there was not uniquely bad enough to cause whatever situation is going on now. But it's like, this is a level of sloppiness that is really dangerous, because when you're putting out a video like this and you're saying Trudeau is responsible for this, and if you go down to the comment section of this video, it's all of his fans and all of the probably people he picked up who are anti-Trudeau in this country, essentially an echo chamber. This is not Trudeau's fault. This particular policy you're describing had nothing to do with Trudeau. I don't even think Trudeau was an MP when this was going on.
Right. And then so you couldn't even find the article that he's citing?
No. That's horrible. Like, again, imagine if this was like Rationality Rules or someone like this, who was like, I found this great new argument to debunk theism, and he puts up a flashy title, and it's like, where did you get that from? I need to know your source.
Yeah. That's pretty messed up. You just make up a source.
I made it up.
Okay. Yeah.
Hit the economy with more private investment, but it didn't quite work out that way. Instead, the massive amounts of free credit and easy borrowed money created a gold rush for investors. They started bidding wars for homes, massively increasing the prices. A lot of this investment was focused on rental properties, either so that the rent could then be increased or just...
And this did happen. largely in Canada.
Yeah,
It still is a
yeah.
problem to this day where people have second properties as speculative investment holes. But it's also your average citizens doing this as well. It's like let's not pretend it's solely, you know, a cabal of mysterious investors who are at the top of the
Right.
food chain and doing this. You know, this is also something that your average upper middle class Canadian citizen will absolutely do to screw over their fellow citizen.
Exactly.
into second homes. And this brings us right back to reality and the outstandingly poor rental market in Canada. Let's go over what we've just been talking about: gentrification and the transformation of.
Okay, so just to be clear.
Yep.
Hold on.
And this brings us right back to reality and the outstandingly poor rental market in Canada. Let's go over what we've just been talking about.
Okay, so this never happened.
As far as I understand the economic policy describing, I can guarantee you Trudeau did not do this. As far as whether or not the Canadian government did,
That's
my
a
friend and I,
different-
we were
yeah.
going through this, we were like, this doesn't make much sense at all. So I would say this is an oversimplification of a flawed argument, is the best way I can describe it.
Yeah, okay.
Gentrification and the transformation of cities decrease the supply of rental properties. Foreign investment decreased the supply of rental properties. And finally, the Canadian government's decision to create a housing market feeding frenzy made things even worse. There have been plenty of other factors that we don't really have time to explore here, like Canada's
course we
welcoming
don't.
of short-term let.
Of course,
Right.
you know. I don't even want to talk about like his stuff. Let's keep this in Toronto. One of the biggest problems for years in Toronto that, again, a city like Montreal did not have this problem. Toronto had something called the Yellow Belt, which was, I believe, 60% of our land in the city was zoned for exclusively single-family housing. That meant that even if you were a developer and you wanted to build something as simple as like a fourplex, like, you know, I want to put 4 people in one house that you sometimes see in like New York or in Philadelphia or in the old East Coast cities, they couldn't do that. And that was only just overturned either this year or last year. That's a huge factor in the housing crisis in Toronto. You can't ignore that. You basically turned 60% of the land zoned exclusively for single families. That's huge, you know?
Right.
All sorts of other factors that are going on here besides just financialization. Yes, financialization is a problem. Yes, the rendering of the housing market towards an asset and towards an investment property is a bad thing. Let's not pretend it's the only thing. And more importantly than this, housing is 3 levels of government. It's the federal, it's the provincial, and it's the municipal. Does Trudeau shoulder maybe a third of the blame for this? Perhaps, if you can point to a particular policy he's, you know, implemented, which we've yet to do 10 minutes into the video, which is also kind of worrying me a little bit. But it's like you can equally put that blame on city council, and you can put it at Queen's Park. It's like, you know, all these levels of government have not reacted as fast to a housing crisis as they should have.
Right. All right.
The Airbnb market in Canadian cities is absolutely massive, and each one is a home that could have gone to someone who actually lives there. But the results are the same. Regular people have been pushed out of their homes, and barely anyone can afford to live in these cities anymore. Now to even survive in Toronto,
I mean, that's any city, so.
Barely afford to live in the city. I mean, what is your measure for barely afford? Like, Toronto is not turning into Detroit in the 1990s, where the population were
Yeah.
fleeing. The population growth in Toronto has been
All
up
right, now we're
and
gonna get
stable
to
forever.
now we're gonna get to specific numbers. So you
Okay,
ready for this?
hit me with some numbers. I'm
you
ready.
need to make at least 60,000 a year. Honestly, it's more
60,000. Okay.
like
60,000
80,000 if you actually wanna
Canadian
own any
is-
possessions. In the other line,
Yeah. Go ahead.
So yeah, 60 to $80,000 Canadian. I would say that's maybe about $50 to $60,000 American, depending on your metric.
Yeah.
It's a lot of money, but most people in Toronto actually do make that money. And this is one of the other reasons where I think there's outrage is there's a lot of people who live in the more conservative ridings in Canada who live in smaller towns where, you know, your cost of living is lower. So they can get by on $40,000, $50,000 a year, and they see a number like $60,000 or $80,000 a year, and they think that's ludicrous. How could you afford to live in there? And the thing about Toronto is, it's like a lot of people can. I'm not pretending that everyone can.
Yeah,
We have
yeah.
poor neighborhoods in Toronto. We have neighborhoods that are poorly served by resources, and we have people who struggle to get by on 1 or 2 jobs, like any city in the world. But the idea that Toronto is this uniquely unlivable city because of cost of living is wrong. Otherwise, we would have seen the population fleeing a long time ago. And he's about to bring up the other major cities in Eastern Canada. Curious he doesn't mention Alberta at any point in time in this video, which is fascinating to me as a Canadian. But it's
cities
all
is-
of these cities have different environments.
Yep.
a little bit better, but that really isn't saying much. So why did they let all of this happen? We can give a pretty simple answer based on basic speculation. It's simply the fact that all of this has made a few powerful people filthy rich. The people who can
Okay. That.
Ooh, Trudeau did this so that his buddies can get more money. I'm going to need to see the proof. I'm going to need to see the receipts on that. There is a trend amongst all politicians and all political parties to be towards landlords or investment property owners. I believe it's 1/3 of all MPs, but this is a bipartisan issue. This is not a uniquely evil policy. And, you know, having like an investment in the housing market could be your spouse is a landlord, you know, could be someone you know is like, it's such there is no cabal that is in control of Trudeau or in control of his policies that's trying to make it harder for the average Canadian.
All right.
Control policy are also the people who own lots of assets and benefit from skyrocketing house prices. They don't care what happens to regular people, they'll push the prices as high as they can as long as people still show up to work every day. It's in this way that high housing prices are a symptom of how unequal the economy has become. But high housing prices, and particularly high rental prices, also creates lots of problems for society by themselves. First, there's the direct cost to companies. Commercial rents have shot up along with residential rents, forcing many businesses to close under the pressure. It's a massive factor on its own, but the problem goes deeper than that. Overall, 33% of Canadians rent, but it's much higher in the cities. In Toronto, it's 48%. Quebec City is at 49%. Vancouver's at around 55%, and in Montreal, over 60% of the residents are renting. As the rents
Now,
in all of those
here's where we have to get into an interesting conversation about renting very briefly. And how are we doing
Yeah.
for time, Kyle? I want to make sure I'm not dragging you down too much.
We'll just finish the video. We got
Yep.
like 5 minutes of video left, so.
So yeah, renting is a necessary step for a lot of people. I know there's this idea, and particularly I know in conservative American, and I don't mean to keep demonizing conservatives. That's not my point, but it is the stereotype of you finish your degree or whatever, and you buy a white picket fence in the suburb, and you raise a family there. And for a lot of people around the world, that's just not immediately achievable or attainable. Now, I think Montreal leaning towards 60% being renters. That's not good. But the idea of people renting, especially if they're students, especially if they're, young adults, you don't want to have people who are in their 40s and 50s renting. That looks very,
Right.
very bad. But the idea of a place to rent is not inherently a bad thing.
It just depends on who rents.
Yeah, and for what reasons as well. If it's because you legitimately can't afford anywhere, which is, I will admit, part of the reason it's high in places like Vancouver.
Well, another
that's-
reason is like transition, right? So for me, I only make maybe $200-300 a week, but I'm a college student. I'm transitioning into teaching.
Yep.
So share, I'm going to be making 5 times more. So sometimes there might be transition periods where renting is, kind of okay, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a necessary part in your evolution into being an adult,
Right. So all right. Anyway.
And I also do want to note that the average rent in Canada has dropped. Part of the reason, again, it was so high is COVID. We'll keep coming back to COVID, and it's high because of COVID. It's down for the first time. Things are looking better in Canada right now.
Probably Canada's going to burn.
I love you, Daniel.
Uh,
He can try. It's not going to though.
yeah. All right.
cities have skyrocketed in recent years, wages have also stagnated. In fact, they've even gone backwards compared to inflation and the cost of living. You can tell by
That,
looking
by
at
the
a
way,
stat
that
called
article
real
is
GDP.
10 years old that he just cited about
Oh.
the backwards article. That's not an up-to-date source.
Switch. Oh, this one. Okay.
Average hourly wages have barely budged in 40 years. By the way, again, let's file that one under. That's not a federal problem. That's a provincial problem. The
Right.
minimum wage in Ontario and British Columbia is higher than it is in the rest of the country because the housing market is so high. And we don't have a federally mandated minimum wage. It is a provincial one. The federal minimum wage is, I believe, for employees who work for federal governments. So that's, take that problem up with your bosses in Quebec City or in Victoria or in Edmonton or in Toronto. You don't take that up with the Parliament in Ottawa.
Right. All right. Let's continue.
Cost of living. You can tell by looking at a stat called real GDP per capita, and it measures how much the average citizen of a country earns adjusted to inflation. So looking at it will tell you how much real buying power the average person really has. This is a graph comparing Canada's real GDP per capita to the USA's, and
All right.
It's true. I don't have any serious disagreements for this
Objection.
sort of thing. But it's as you'll notice, we've traditionally been under you for what is that, the 60s or the 80s or the 90s?
Yeah.
We've been traditionally under you for most of the time. I'm sorry, you guys have 8 times the population, whatever it is.
Yeah.
There's more of you than us. Your economy is by default going to be more productive so long as you don't have a complete
Yeah,
idiot
you're
running your
blame-
country.
You're gonna blame Trudeau for for this.
You might as well blame Trudeau for the AIDS epidemic at that point in time.
I know, right? Anyways, continue.
and it's not pretty. It's not like people in the US are having a great time, but in Canada it's been getting even worse in the past few years. Now we're at a point where the wage problem has gotten so bad that across the board, Canadians have lower salaries than people.
Okay, here's
But that's
the smoking gun right here. What do you say? What do you
smoking
say
gun
about
right there. Our dollar's weaker than yours. That's kind of a necessity. You have the most traded currency in the world. It's I'd rather we compare the Canadian dollars what's going on in Australia or Switzerland or something like that. That's a fair fight. But
Yeah. 50%.
yeah, so it's it depends on the industry. Medium wages, yeah, but it depends on where exactly you work and what you do. I know the oil sands jobs in Alberta and in Newfoundland are particularly lucrative. If you compare that to another discipline, I'm not entirely sure that it's going to be such a negative picture.
All right, let's continue.
people from the US. It doesn't matter which state or province you compare. The housing crisis has also played a large role in this. People who are forced to spend over 50% of their paycheck towards rent don't have much disposable income. When all you can focus on is surviving, there's not much time for thriving. And this has a knock-on effect on the rest of the economy in a way that's hard to measure on paper. But the results are clear in practice. The nightlife industry has been hit particularly hard. Its recent struggles is...
All right, what do you have to say about the nightlife industry?
Well, if this is where I reveal my secret superpower that I've been hiding from this entire stream. I work as a waiter downtown Toronto, right in the middle of the financial district. This is actually my serving uniform I've got on right now because I was too lazy to change when I got home from a shift. The number one reason, he's going to get to this in a second, that the nightlife industry is suffering is COVID. Because it turns out when you mandate a bunch of people to stay inside, they don't go to restaurants, they don't go to bars, they don't go to clubs, they don't go to raves. You know, that was the number one talking point that everyone in the industry has been talking about is how do we bounce back post-COVID? Yeah, they'll throw around, oh, we might be, you know, close to a recession or there might be too much inflation or something thrown around there. But the number one reason is it's like, you know, COVID happened. Like, let's please not forget about the 2-year-long pandemic that screwed everything up.
Yeah, all right.
Symptomatic of the wider problem. A report by a research firm called IBIS World showed that over the last 5 years, Canada's nightlife industry contracted by over 4%.
And I have to pause this because it's one of the funniest things. First of all, it's such a uniquely British complaint that the nightlife is bad. I'll throw that out in the first place. But the second thing is, if you read this report, not only does it show the dip to be right when COVID happens and it goes back up the minute COVID ends, if you scroll down the report like one paragraph more than what this guy clearly read to, you will find a sentence that says, by the way, it's expected to grow by like 4 or 5% in the next 5 years. So it's like, clearly that was COVID and clearly we're going back to normal.
Yeah.
Years, Canada's nightlife industry contracted by over 4%. The shutdown caused lots of damage, but nightclubs and bars fail to recover afterwards because people just don't have enough money to justify going out very often, if at all. And this is creating a deadly spiral. Rents go up and nightclubs have to charge even more to stay open. And this makes them less attractive to people already paying.
Here we go. Here's the, you know, nightmare scenario.
The nightmare scenario that I can promise you, I was in Montreal with a buddy of mine. Clubs were not dead there. Clubs were not dead there. Not dead in Toronto either. So I don't know what he thinks is going on. This is why I'm sorry. I do have to flex. Like, this is why you need to have a Canadian here to tell you that it's like, are things bad? Yes. Our housing prices are kind of stupid. The grocery stores are overinflating and shrinkflating everything. There are real problems in Canada. Homelessness is on the rise. But it's not as bad as this guy's making it out to be. It's not a matter of survival, as he says. You know, any more so than living in any other major city in an industrialized Western country is a matter of survival.
All right, let's play this Doom trail then.
Yeah, let's go. The cycle.
Massive rent bills every month, and so they get less customers. Less customers then means they have to charge even more, and it goes on until they have to close. This industry has been hit particularly hard because of their unusual clientele. Young people are the most likely to go out, but they're also more likely to be renting and have less income than older people. But
they're also the least likely to be responsible with their money. I mean, I have colleagues who live paycheck to paycheck, and the reason they live paycheck to paycheck is because they go out and they get plastered every Sunday. It's like, you know, young people are notoriously not anti-fun. They will find a way to find places that are cheap, and companies want young people, or bars and clubs, they want young people to come there. You know, I can't tell you the number of the schemes that we've tried to do to get more people to come in during happy hour or something like that. You know?
Yeah. Exactly.
Across the whole of the Canadian economy. Less disposable income means less consumer spending. Businesses jack up their prices to compensate, and the same deadly spiral comes into effect. Of course, lots of corporations also use the crisis to hike up prices even further, while lining their executives and their shareholders' pockets. And the end result of all of this is that it just makes life worse. You have to think about it all the time, like making sure you only buy the cheapest versions of food, or even limiting your diet entirely based on what's cheaper. For the people who've been hit the hardest, it becomes a question of which bill you can afford to not pay. Often food is one of the first things you have to give up. Then there's the non-essentials. Things you can only afford as rare luxuries like holidays or meals out at restaurants are now completely off the table. This brings us right back around to Trudeau's usual
it's such a doomer scenario. Like, yeah, there's problems. There's food bank uses have exploded, especially among students, because the rent is not necessarily good in Toronto right now. It's up, I believe, 42%, or 42% of new food bank users are students. But it's also like, you know, we aren't seeing people out starving on the streets. And I think one of the other things that kind of happens in Western countries is we don't realize how lucky we are compared to, you know, the situation in Ukraine, the situation in Syria, the situation in Gaza. Is it's like, you know, there are companies, you know, I don't want to be the token lefty here, but there's a real part of this, which is just general practices of capitalism. Is it's like, you know, if the company is not making enough money, they owe it to their shareholders to make money. They're going to jack the prices. If you don't like that, you can take it up with the system that's running it, essentially, in my opinion.
Yeah. All right. Let's finish the video.
Let's close it off.
and his assertion that Canada's problem is a labor shortage. This comes as an insult to people who are working as hard as they can, but just aren't getting a fair deal from their country for it. Working long hours just to scrape by is easily comparable to the effects that long-term unemployment has on people. You get the same worries with it, like the stress of not knowing whether you'll make it through the next month, or how far into the future you can go on for. But at the same time, you still have to work long hours every day. Wages have stagnated for years, prices are still rising, and a third of Canadian renters can't afford their rent. And it's no wonder then that so many people are slipping through the cracks when they're being squeezed this hard. Canada is now on track to have over 500,000 homeless people by 2030. The streets and the shelters are overflowing, and 10 cities have become a common sight in most large Canadian cities. And this is particularly awful in Canada, where temperatures drop well below freezing for months at a time. Homelessness and poverty breeds crime and drug use. It might not be long before Canada loses its reputation for beauty and friendliness precisely because its government has been so harsh to its people. Immigration is wrapped up in this as well, and it's another reason the situation in
And
Canada
here's a very, very important thing to note as well. And this is where one of the things I will absolutely blame Trudeau for this. And it's very interesting that a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that you hear in Canada is not because of xenophobia or racism or nationalism. It's because we don't have enough housing to house them. Like, Canadians, I would say on the whole, are pretty welcoming and open to immigrants, particularly in large cities like Toronto. So, part of the reason that we wanted the immigration tab, and I'll include myself in this because I think we should have slowed down the immigration a little while ago, is just because we can house them anywhere. There's no point inviting 300,000 people into your country if they're out living in the street.
Yeah, exactly.
Become so dire. Trudeau and the wider establishment have been happy to facilitate mass migration into Canada for years because it suits their interests. More immigrants means more working people to fill jobs and a more productive economy. At least that's how the theory went, but it fails to consider all the negative effects that immigration has had. Nearly everyone who moves to a country either temporarily or permanently is looking for work, but they also need a place to stay, and this only adds fuel to the housing crisis fire. More demand means higher prices, and recent migrants are much more likely to be renting a place than buying it, meaning migration has an outsized effect on the rental market in particular. Crumbling under an overwhelming wave of public opinion, Trudeau has finally announced that Canada will be limiting immigration more for the next few years at least.
We're reducing the numbers of.
Yep.
And this is a good policy in my opinion. It's too little too late from Trudeau, and this guy's about to say, it's clear he's only doing this because there's an election coming up. It's like, of course he is. He's a politician. Are you surprised? Like, a lot of this, and then I think the last thing, because we'll be wrapping up this video with the next clip. I think what annoys me a lot about this is that there's no substantive attempt to find a solution here. It's a lot of Trudeau bad in the same of like, how like Republicans get very, very angry when there's certain portions of the Democratic base who just go orange man bad. Like that's kind of what's going on here as well. Is it's red man bad.
Immigrants that will come to Canada for the next 3 years.
For lots of people, though, it's a little bit too late. We can be sure that the move definitely has nothing to do with its upcoming re-election campaign and its historically low approval ratings. For a lot of Canadians at this point, any kind of change at the top would be a welcome relief from nearly a decade of the same government. But these long-term problems aren't going to reverse themselves anytime soon, and it could be a long time before Canada can get back on its feet once again.
All right, that's it.
So what did we learn today, Kyle? We learned that Canada is a demonic hellscape where the people are eating each other on the streets, and there's no chance of good life. But in all seriousness, is my country perfect? No. Is my city perfect? No. Are there serious societal problems that we are facing and are trying to get through together as a country? Absolutely. But this sort of slop, if I can call it, is not a good way to engage in discussion around this kind of content. I don't know if you've noticed, like, a lot of the buzzwords he was using in those videos, they remind me of like when I'm trying to bullshit my way through an essay, and it's just I'm trying to make a point, but I don't have all my sources, so I'm just gonna start typing words that sound impressive together. It's a shame because it's reached a lot of people, and clearly Trudeau does have to go in one way or the other. Either the Liberals win and they kick him out, or he loses the next election, because he's just a very, very divisive and unpopular figure here. I think what I hope this stream has kind of done is it's clarified for an American audience what's really going on in Canada. We've got our problems, folks. It's not a perfect country, but these kind of videos don't help. They don't help paint the picture. I wonder how much of
you make up a source that doesn't exist.
that's bad. When you misinterpret sources and articles, that's bad. Talk to actual Canadians. Don't if anyone's got any questions after this video, you can shoot Kyle an email, and I'll try to get back to them with the substantive stuff as I can. But it's like, do your own research, read your own stuff, go to the source. It's the same principles that we would apply in philosophy of religion. Go to the journals, go to the experts, or go to the people like Kyle who are good enough at understanding the experts to be able to intelligently comment. Don't just go to a random YouTube comment, and don't go to a YouTuber who's very clearly got an agenda. I have an agenda. I've tried to keep it in check for as much as possible throughout this video. The only agenda that I will never try to keep in check is that I love my country very much. And I hope things get better for us,
Oh, so you're telling me Canada's not going to get annexed by America?
You can try, folks. It's going to be a lot harder than you think.
All right. Well, I'm going to end this stream now, but yeah. So, if you guys have any questions, just email me. And then hopefully Thomas will really answer that question back. Anyways, God bless.
Take care.